I have with me here a group of distinguished experts who are some of the leading people in the world on the topic of vaccine injury. So here, let me just start. We can just go down. So we have Toby Rogers. Why don't you just give a brief introduction to yourself and how long you've been working on this, all that stuff.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me out there?
Loud.
A little louder. I'll get as close as I can, but I'm pretty soft-spoken. So, look, we're all here by accident, right? We'd rather be out golfing or being architects or painters or something like that. We all fell into this issue by accident. So I was in a PhD program at the University of Sydney. I was studying political economy. I was studying Adam Smith's views on slavery. I was 1 year into my PhD program, and my then partner's son was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. So I thought, well, I have access to a world-class university, and I have digital access to nearly all scientific and medical journals in the world. Why don't I just spend 1 day researching autism just to wrap my head around what's happening? So at the time, the CDC had a web page called The Causes of Autism. So I thought that'd be a promising place to start. And to be honest, I was somewhat daunted. I'm a social scientist, and here I'm asking questions about medicine and the physical sciences. So I needed to be humble about things and cautious and defer to authority. So I go to the CDC webpage on the causes of autism, and it says, well, it's likely genetic. But I'm in a PhD program, so you're not allowed to read secondary sources. You have to read primary sources. So I looked at their footnote. Footnote number 1, autism is genetic. When downloaded, printed the study, free printing in the PhD program, so I printed it out, marked it up. The study was filled with platitudes. They hadn't found a gene for autism or many genes. It was just we generally sort of kind of think that genes cause autism. That was their claim. Furthermore, I knew that autism rates were skyrocketing. There's no such thing as a genetic epidemic. So the claim itself was illogical. I thought, wait a second, what's going on here? The number one cause that the CDC is arguing causes autism doesn't check out. And then they said, well, okay, there's some environmental factors. The valproic acid can cause autism if taken during pregnancy. I didn't know what valproic acid was, so I looked it up. It's a treatment for epilepsy, but it's contraindicated in pregnancy. You would never take valproic acid if you knew that you were pregnant. So other than a few accidental cases of accidental ingestion, you're not going to get autism from valproic acid because it's contraindicated in pregnancy. That can't be driving the autism epidemic. And then the CDC webpage said, well, thalidomide causes autism. I thought, no what? And so I looked it up. Sure enough, thalidomide was never approved for use in the United States. There are about 10,000 injuries in the United States from people who are traveling overseas who took it. But it was never approved for use in the United States. So the CDC in 2015 is claiming genetics, valproic acid, thalidomide. And it just kept going on like that. Every time I checked their sources, it didn't check out. And here I'm a social scientist, and within a few hours, I already knew that the CDC's story did not check out. And I wept at that point. I was a true believer in the state. I was a true believer in the CDC. I just wanted to get back to my work on Adam Smith. And the CDC either was incompetent or lying. So I worked on it for another day and another day. I worked on it for 6 weeks. I changed my doctoral thesis topic to the political economy of autism. Spent the next 4 years reading everything that's been written on autism, causation, prevalence, and cost. My doctoral thesis, The Political Economy of Autism, has become one of the most downloaded doctoral research papers in the entire world. And I've worked on this for the last 10 years, both in my PhD program and then for Children's Health Defense and now for the Brownstone Institute. So I realized that I had accidentally stumbled into the largest political economy problem in American history. And the paradox here is that autism is not a scientific and a medical mystery. We know what's causing autism. Autism is a political economy problem of regulatory capture and epistemic capture. And epistemic capture means that the pharmaceutical industry has captured every step in the knowledge production process in science and medicine. So anytime a reporter calls a doctor or a scientist, where they're speaking to a captured entity who was trained in a medical school and with a textbook and a professor, that were all captured by the pharmaceutical industry. So autism is a problem, and the vaccine epidemic, all the harms that come from vaccines, is a problem of regulatory capture and epistemic capture. And so this is right in my wheelhouse. And until we can do something about regulatory capture and epistemic capture, we're going to continue to have epidemics of autism and all sorts of other disorders. So that's how I got into this work.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Yes, we all have our own way we fell down the rabbit hole. So John, would you care to?
Thanks, Mark. Can everybody hear me? My name is John Leake. I'm a nonfiction author. My most recent book, I'm the principal author with Dr. Peter McCullough in Dallas, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. It's a critical evaluation of the entire history of the vaccine enterprise going back to the 18th century. Those of you who are interested in American history, we start with the smallpox outbreak in Boston, Massachusetts in 1721. An interesting little bit of trivia. The first great advocate, and he was a great intellectual, there's no doubt about it, but the first great American, well, he's British-American intellectual who advocated vaccinology was Cotton Mather. Does anybody remember who Cotton Mather was? He was a great theologian, Puritan theologian in Boston. He was also an advising theologian to the judges who presided over the Salem witch trials. So an interesting bridge of burgeoning science. He was a member of the Royal Society, but he was also very interested in theology. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing that we should all be thinking about as we discuss this. We're oftentimes told that vaccines are a purely scientific enterprise, but in fact, they're a deeply metaphysical and deeply religious artifact as well. And oftentimes, the line between faith and scientific evaluation is strongly blurred. I was happy to hear that the New York Times was here. Your newspaper was honest enough to report that we were a bestseller. Perhaps you people at the Times might even read it. I should say, the one other thing I would add is that my formal training is in philosophy, specifically logic, but I guess in the late 90s, I decided it would be better to make a living writing nonfiction books that are interesting to the general public and not just academic philosophers. I got into true crime writing, and a key element of all crime is fraud. In order to evade detection for a crime, it's necessary to lie about it. And we have individual criminal acts, and we have organized crime. The thing I'm concerned about in this nation's capital of ours, Washington, D.C., where we find ourselves today, is it's become a den of organized crime. Our great President Eisenhower, in effect, warned us about this in his 1961 farewell address, in which he warned about the undue influence of the military-industrial complex. Now, that specific concept that Eisenhower raised is oftentimes quoted and oftentimes remembered. What is the military-industrial complex? It's this combination of military industry, Department of Defense, and a whole area throughout every institution. I mean, if you've not seen Eisenhower's speech, you can watch it on YouTube. He talks about the military-industrial complex as extending its tentacles into every institution, from higher education to scientific research for weapons development to biomedical research, all the way to our great newspapers of record. So he does not only mention the military-industrial complex, he also mentions what he calls the scientific technological elite. And if you want to see an example of the scientific technological elite gone badly amiss, you needn't look any further than Anthony Fauci, the head of the NIAID, during the COVID-19 pandemic, in which it seemed to me, as I was watching this in real time, that Fauci had in effect become the de facto public policy formulator of the Trump administration in his first term. Eisenhower warned about this explicitly because members of the scientific technological elite have special training. The members of our representative government are hesitant, they lack confidence to actually question them. And I think we really saw that with COVID. So to come down to our specific point today, what is the reality of this vaccine program? Who is it that has been driving it since the introduction of the DPT shot to the early childhood schedule in 1948? And then what on earth are we to make of the fact that the vaccine manufacturers, both with the so-called swine flu scare of 1976, and then subsequently with the Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, what are we to make of the apparent paradox that on the one hand they're safe and effective, but then we're told in the same sentence, however, they're not safe and effective for everybody. So if we're going to continue manufacturing these products, we need to be granted liability protection. I'll conclude my introduction with one last remark. If anybody in this room has not read the dissenting opinions of Justice Sotomayor and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the 2010 case Bruesewitz versus Wyeth, I strongly recommend that everybody read the dissenting opinions of those two great liberal justices in 2010, because they spell out with perfect judicial reasoning why the 1986 Vaccine Injury Act is inimical to vaccines being made safe and effective. So I strongly recommend, if you've not read particularly Sotomayor's opinion, I strongly suggest you read it. Our esteemed colleagues from the New York Times and other press, you too might consider reading Sotomayor's dissenting opinion in Bruesewitz versus Wyeth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Moving down the list, we have Nick. You want to give yourself an introduction?
Yes. So my name is Nicolas Hulscher. I began my journey in this health freedom space at the University of Michigan School of Public Health in 2023. I needed an internship to do some research, and I reached out to every single professor. One of them said yes. It took about a month to receive that yes. So in the meantime, as I was trying to get an internship, I reached out to Dr. Peter McCullough, and he responded in 5 minutes with an internship idea, a research idea. And what that ended up being, because, well, first of all, I went into the University of Michigan for epidemiology training. I wanted to make a difference, particularly given the disaster that we faced in 2020, 2021, and on. And that internship ended up being a systematic review of autopsy findings in deaths after COVID-19 vaccination. So at the center of University of Michigan I was doing research looking at deaths after the COVID shot, and that angered many professors. I was told I would never have a career, but I didn't care. I did it anyways, and so I'm very happy I did. That paper eventually was published in Forensic Science International. It became the #1 most accessed paper, according to the Observatory of International Research, about 2 weeks after it was published. And then 2 weeks later, the journal cartel is what I call it, retracted it for unethical reasons, probably illegal. And so that happened. And then it was republished a second time, thankfully. So right now it's up. It's been peer-reviewed 2 times. We basically demonstrated a causal link between COVID shots and death. So after that, since then on, since I graduated, I was able to now contribute to the publication of about 25 scientific studies looking at the harms of vaccines, the possible causes of autism, of childhood vaccines, COVID shots, SARS-CoV-2, bird flu, etc. And so, yeah, that's my story.
Brian, please.
Hi, I'm Brian Hooker, and I am the Chief Scientific Officer of Children's Health Defense, and I've been a part of the Board of Directors since about 2018, and joined Children's Health Defense as an employee as their Chief Scientific Officer in 2021. I was a happy little scientific researcher. I was a scientific engineering nerd at a national laboratory, and lo and behold, my wife and I decided to have a kid in 1998. And in 1998, there weren't as many vaccines in the schedule, but many of the vaccines contained the mercury-containing preservative, the Marisol. My son was born uneventfully. It was a cesarean section, and it oddly corresponded when the doctor really needed to go home for dinner. Imagine that. So my wife ended up having a cesarean section. They said it was cephalopelvic disproportion. Not really sure if that was true or not, but that started our odyssey with the medical community. And we thought we were educated on vaccines. We thought we knew what was going on with vaccines. I grew up, my mom was a public health nurse, and she was in charge of the distribution and tracking of vaccines in Riverside County, which is one of the larger counties in Southern California. And, I grew up with pamphlets about vaccines around my house. I knew what the infectious diseases were, but I really didn't know that vaccine injury was a thing. And I really had no clue. I remember signing the vaccine information forms for my son to get vaccinated at 2 weeks when he got the hepatitis B shot, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 12 months, and then 15 months. That's the first time that we really even asked a question. Now, my son was tracking slow, but he was tracking slow normal. And so, I can remember we were older parents, so we worried about everything. And remember cramming for his Denver developmental test before he would go in, so he could be the star baby and do really well on his developmental test. Yes, he's crawling. Yes, he's walking. Yes, he's standing up. Yes, he's sitting up. Yes, he's babbling. But all of that came to a screeching halt at his 15-month well baby checkup, where he had an ear infection. He wasn't a well baby. We knew that he had an ear infection because we had seen the ear, nose, throat doctor earlier and got that diagnosed the same day. But being the good parents wanting to impress our practitioners, we took him in for his well baby checkup anyway, even though he was a sick baby. We asked the practitioner that day, it was a nurse practitioner, when they offered his Haemophilus influenza B, his DTaP, and his oral polio vaccine, if it was safe to vaccinate a sick child. And she said, she never really answered the question. She just said, oh, we do it all the time. We do it all the time. Absolutely. Let's go ahead and get this done. And from public health perspective, a bird in the hand is when you want to vaccinate a child. So if the child is for a well baby appointment, then they will vaccinate that child. They'll basically tell you whatever it takes in order to get that child vaccinated. And that's what's happened that day. My son received those vaccines. He immediately went to a high-pitched scream. And we've heard this over and over and over again. And he had cataclysmic inflammation. He had encephalopathy, encephalitis, and that the fever that he had after the vaccines and the ear infection lasted 18 days. And so we treated not only with baby aspirin, but for the first time in his little life, he was getting baby Tylenol. We'd have to rotate back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And on day 18, that fever broke. And very, very quickly and very, very precipitously, he lost everything. He lost eye contact. He had about 10 words at the time. He lost all of the words. He lost a lot of motor control that day, and for a while even stopped walking unassisted. And now we know that it was a vestibular gait problem that he acquired because of his vaccine injury. And then at 18 months, he was developed full-blown autism and was diagnosed at his 18-month well-baby checkup that he had full-blown autism. So it was as clear as the nose on our face that it was vaccines. We were fortunate to have an integrative practitioner that we started to interact with at his second birthday who said, no more vaccines for this child. And that's probably one of the nicest, most wonderful gifts I think I've ever been given in my entire life, that we had a practitioner who would actually tell us no vaccines. That started my odyssey. I had letters behind my name. The individuals at the CDC had letters behind their name. I thought, I'll pick up the phone and I'll give them a call. Well, it's not that easy. I was encountered by one, Dr. William Thompson at the time, who said that his daughter had all the same thimerosal-containing vaccines as my son, and she was absolutely fine. So, but that doesn't wash with a scientist. You just do not give that a scientist that type of in. So I ripped him a new one. And somehow it stuck because he did call me about 12 years later and started confessing about the fraud and the malfeasance at the CDC. And so back in 2001, 2002, that started my odyssey. I started publishing papers on vaccines and autism in 2004. My career trajectory changed because of that. I started working at a university that protected my academic freedom in 2010, and I've been able to publish epidemiological papers ever since. That's the start of my journey. It will never be the same. I love when Secretary Kennedy says that he will die with his boots on, protecting these children and making a better life for these children. Well, I will die with my wingtips on, doing the same thing. Thank you very much.
So let me put a question to the panel. I'll let anybody take this. So when you're trying to talk to people, perhaps people are skeptical, what are the most compelling pieces of evidence that that you can muster to explain the size and the scope of the vaccine epidemic, and that how we know it and what it is? How do you explain this to people?
Well, I first go to the fact that over 33 million children in the United States right now have some type of chronic condition excluding obesity. And that has increased by fourfold since the 1980s. And it does track directly with the vaccination schedule. So that's the first, just the magnitude. When you think of an epidemic, it's not 1,000 cases of measles in South Carolina or 700 cases of measles in Texas. It is the epidemic of 33 million children between ages 3 and 17 years old in the United States now have at least one chronic condition. Those chronic conditions are linked to environmental stressors and environmental toxins. And if you look at the perfect delivery system for environmental stressors and toxins, it is direct injection. It goes directly into the bloodstream. It is 100% absorption. So why would the federal government, why would the CDC, the HHS, the NIH, the FDA look everywhere else except for vaccinations?
Yeah, the thing that really impressed me was specifically the entire literature on autism. For those who aren't familiar with it, it was first characterized back in the 40s by two guys. One was an Austrian named Hans Asperger, and the other one was an Austrian expat to the United States named Leo Kanner. And both of them, in their early observational literature, characterized this as extremely rare and in most cases congenital. It seemed that the babies had been born this way, this developmental retardation with many peculiar features, but they seem to have been born with it. Now, Asperger mentions one case, a little boy named Helmut, who seemed to have developed these symptoms after a smallpox vaccine. So that's the early literature. Both of these guys characterize this as extremely rare. And then we get into the 70s and then in the 80s, and suddenly it's not rare anymore. I mean, when I was born in 1970, it was estimated to have been about 1 in 10,000 children who had symptomology similar to what Connor and Asperger pointed out, 1 in 10,000. Now, I think the CDC's latest estimate is that it's about 1 in 31 children are around the age of 8 are being diagnosed or have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Now, there's no way that can be accounted for by some radical, in the space of 40, 50 years, change of the human genome. I mean, anybody who just stops and thinks for one moment logically knows we can't be evolving in a maladaptive way that fast. So what is causing it? And I mentioned that I come out of a background of formal philosophy and then true crime. I mean, you have to ask, well, what are the main environmental shifts that we've had that our children have been exposed to? And then you look at when the vaccine manufacturers got full liability protection, it's 1986. So it's important to remember these two things. First of all, that was intended for the schedule that was already in place. It was DPT, measles, mumps, rubella, and polio. Not surprisingly, the vaccine manufacturer said, liability protection, holy smokes, this is a bonanza. So they started adding a shot after a shot after a shot to the schedule, purportedly to protect children from just every microbe out there. I recently read a paper out of Boston. They're working on a vaccine to prevent children from becoming addicted to drugs and alcohol. Let's vaccinate them against everything. So with that granting of liability protection in 86, Mark showed the graph. I mean, the CHD Brian has done these studies for years. It's just lockstep. The more vaccines are introduced to the schedule, the more autism goes up. So if you say, well, like Sanjay Gupta, my favorite logician, Sanjay Gupta, we don't know what's causing the dramatic spike of autism. However, we do know that it's not caused by vaccines. So anyway, this is what needs to be rigorously investigated. And what we're seeing, and what's very obvious to anyone who really examines the totality of this, is that there is a prevailing orthodoxy against looking at this. That there has been a veil that's been drawn across it, and I had an interview with Aaron Seary just the other day. He said, you need to understand the selective process that's happened. If you're questioning this, then you don't get the grant. You don't get the position in immunology. You don't get the whatever the economic incentive may be in order to support the research. You don't get it if you question the orthodoxy. So, in summation, this just isn't being looked at. Just a veil has been drawn across the inquiry, and those who do raise questions are branded the equivalent of a heretic during the Counter-Reformation.
If I could add to that, I feel like Thomas Kuhn, in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, underplayed how traumatic paradigm shifts are. I'm mindful of the fact that paradigm shifts are painful. For society, it involves upheaval. Galileo and persecutions by the courts and house arrest and executions and civil wars. Paradigm shifts are painful. What the United States is going through right now, the upheaval in the midst of this paradigm shift from the end of the vaccine era. Can you guys hear me? Again. From the end of the vaccine era to whatever the new paradigm that's coming along that's going to be better. Society's in upheaval over it, but individuals are in upheaval over it. And I think Thomas Kuhn downplayed how difficult paradigm shifts are because it was the middle of the Cold War. And he wanted to make the case that over here in the United States, paradigm shifts are easy. We just change gears, move on to the better paradigm, off we go. It was a comparison against Stalinism and Lysenkoism, where science came from the top down. And it was telling the Soviet system the American way of doing science and medicine is better. But now we have authoritarian top-down science and medicine in the United States. And the paradigm shifts are very difficult and very painful. But I just was reflecting on my own journey from believing in the system to questioning it. And one of the most helpful things that happened to me was a colleague, a classmate, early on in my PhD studies said, I have a housemate who has a vaccine-injured kid. I'd never met somebody who had a vaccine-injured kid before. I didn't know these people existed. She said, "Do you want to have coffee with him?" I said, "Sure, I'll have coffee with him." So we met up for coffee, and I had heard all of the stereotypes and all of the bigotry against anti-vaxxers, that they're crazy conspiracy theorists, believe in aliens and whatnot. So I was going into that meeting with all of the baggage of society, all the stereotypes, all the contempt, all the bigotry. We sat down person to person across a cup of coffee. And I said, "Just tell me your story." And he was a guy about my age, similar haircut, super sweet guy. He said he had a normally developing kid, and they went to a child well baby visit. The child lost speech, eye contact, the ability to socialize. And his life was never the same again. And all the scales from my eyes and all the bigotry melted away. And I realized that this anti-vaxxer was a guy just like me. And the only difference was that his son had gone to a child well baby visit and everything had gone wrong. But I think that's instructive for us. I think the way that we produce change, look, we're in DC, we want to change policy, we want to rewrite the laws, we're doing all those things. But I think change happens one-to-one, conversations over a cup of coffee, telling our stories. And when we do that over and over and over again, we're going to get the paradigm to shift.
So I'd like to say something regarding, how, for somebody that's never heard anything about vaccines, what can you tell them that might, convince them otherwise of what might be occurring? Well, directly injecting 72 doses or 50 injections of toxic materials directly into a 6-month-old infant, small children undergoing critical neurodevelopmental periods, injecting them with aluminum, with formaldehyde traces, it's a carcinogen, with polysorbate 80, it's organ toxic, as well as fetal DNA fragments. There's trillions of fragments of fetal DNA, human DNA from an aborted fetus from the 1960s in the MMR shot. So injecting all of that stuff into a small infant will not improve health outcomes. It's not possible. So that's the first thing to consider. And then the second thing is to really tell if the vaccine is affecting a child's health, you do have to compare the vaccinated children to completely unvaccinated children. And there's been about 13 studies now that have done that. And as Del pointed out earlier on in the presentation, they all found the exact same thing. They all found that the vaccinated children are far sicker across every single domain. And the most important study is an inconvenient study, the Henry Ford study, because it's the best one so far. 18,000 children tracked from birth to average age 10. And literally, every single category was worse off in the vaccinated children. And the shocking point is, though, is so right now 40% of American children have at least one chronic disease. Well, in the Henry Ford study, 57% of the vaccinated children developed at least one chronic disease by age 10. So it's a very similar type of prevalence there that we see. And we actually published a peer review and reanalysis of the Henry Ford study, and we just looked at the raw proportions. And in all 22 of the chronic disease categories, every single one, they were higher in prevalence in the vaccinated children, including cancer, autism, neurodevelopmental disorders were like 12 times higher, autoimmune diseases, skin disorders, everything under the sun, learning disabilities, speech delays, tics, ADHD. So this is a very serious situation, and we really have to start commissioning these vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies. But in the meantime, the answer is quite obvious. These childhood vaccinations that we've been just injecting unlimited amounts into our children have significantly contributed to America's chronic disease epidemic.
So one of the things I've been grappling with, and the people who helped put on this today's event, we're talking about is when you try and describe what vaccine injuries are, they're widespread. They affect all parts of the body. They look all sorts of different ways. How do we communicate to people what are vaccine injuries? How do we get them to recognize them? I mean, it's a real challenge because they certainly, except for, I think the one recognized vaccine injury that everyone recognizes is like your arm hurts at the point of injection. Like they're willing to, it's obvious, there's a direct connection. But for other things that are, separated in, come in different parts of the body, they don't look anything like, measles or bumps or anything like that. How do we get people to see that? Or how do we communicate that if, what we know?
The most clear vignette, and Del has seen it thousands of times. I know that Brian has seen it thousands of times. I've interviewed many parents, and it is a very clear vignette. It's very well documented in the literature. In fact, the United States government even acknowledged it in the case of Hannah Poling in 2008. Child goes in for a baby wellness visit, receives a large bundle of vaccines all at once. This includes inactivated and attenuated infectious disease pathogens and adjuvants to stimulate the immune system. That night, maybe the next morning, the child develops an acute syndrome, oftentimes characterized by a very high fever, oftentimes a febrile seizure, sometimes seizures without a fever, inconsolable crying, can't sleep. The parents panic. They call the pediatrician. The pediatrician acknowledges, well, in some of these cases where children receive these vaccines, they develop this acute post-vaccination syndrome, but it will resolve. Don't worry, Mom. The fever will subside and your child will be fine. But then in a very tight temporal association, the fever resides, but the child isn't fine. The child never resumes his happy babbling, his eye contact with his mother, his smile. He ceases becoming communicative and he becomes withdrawn. The mother then goes back to the pediatrician or to a developmental pediatric psychologist and says, well, what happened to my kid? It was like he was just kidnapped. And she gets the diagnosis of autism. And then she then asks, well, like this happened immediately after the initial acute vignette of high fever and seizures. I've heard this story so many times. I would be blue in the face if I told you how many times I've heard this story. But then comes something that we almost have to, I think the word gaslighting is oftentimes overused. Gaslighting is a method of psychological warfare where you make someone believe intentionally they're losing their mind. It's not exactly the same as deception, but the insanity that it actually induces in the mothers where they're told, oh no, it had nothing to do with the vaccines. This is the perfidy of all of this. And it's very, very hard-hearted for our society and our government institutions to continuously ignore these thousands of parents.
One of the things that we've been studying at Children's Health Defense is the hit that the immune system takes every time a child gets at least a single vaccine. Now, we know that innate immunity, that is the front line of defense. And so if a child has a cough, exposed to a bacterial infection, a viral infection, then really the critical period of time where the innate immune system reacts is pretty much immediately. Within the first, anywhere between the first 15 minutes all the way up to the first 24 hours is innate immunity. And so if that innate immune system is being compromised over and over and over again, prior to Secretary Kennedy, there were 28 different vaccines that were given through the first birthday. And so what we're seeing is more, we're definitely seeing more neurological disorders, definitely seeing more neurodevelopmental disorders, but we're also seeing more sickly children. So we know that the propensity for a child who's following the vaccination schedule, and these are not, this is through an epidemiological study that we're doing through what's called the clinical informatics program. So these are pediatricians that are friendly to CHD. So typically when we look at our vaccinated group, they're only getting about 8 vaccines in that first year of life, but yet their rate of recurring ear infections, recurring strep infections, and recurring respiratory infections is at least double of the children who are unvaccinated. So what we're seeing essentially is that well baby checkups when the child is very, very young begats sick baby checkups when they're older, because the innate immune system, by the time the first year of life is done, the innate immune system is shot.
I would just add, I think that stories are going to be what turns the tide and enables us to win in the end. I think rather than telling people the facts that they're not ready to hear, I think we need to ask, oh, this eczema happened in your life. Well, did you have a shot right before then? Did you have the flu shot right before then? And to share our own stories. I will never get another vaccine again. I didn't take the COVID vaccine. It didn't seem safe. I studied the research. The clinical trial from Pfizer showed increased all-cause mortality in the vaccinated group. So that's why I didn't do it. But everybody has to go through this process for themselves. We can't impose this from the top. Everybody has to do the work for themselves and have the change of heart and mind in their own time. When I was doing my PhD studies, Larry Cook had this website, Facebook page called Stop Mandatory Vaccination. And it was just people sharing their stories all day long. And I could actually watch the autism epidemic happen in real time through this Facebook page, because parents in the middle of the night, when they'd gotten home from the hospital after their child had had seizures and fevers and vomiting and all the other signs of a vaccine injury, would come home with no results from the doctor, and they'd go online, and eventually they'd find their way to Larry Cook's Facebook page, and they would share their stories. Every week, there was a SIDS case where some parent would say, I don't know what happened. My child was perfectly healthy, and then the child suddenly and unexpectedly died. But it was those powerful stories that educated the parents who were seeking advice and changed the hearts and minds of everybody reading that. That's why the censorship is so severe. The pharmaceutical industry cannot exist without censorship. The vaccine program cannot exist without censorship, because when we share our individual stories, our individual testimony, we change hearts and minds. And that's the reason why we were so censored over the last 5 years. And the censorship hasn't stopped. It continues. Now it's just done algorithmically. During the Biden administration, it was done by people in the White House calling people at Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and telling them exactly who to censor. And Dell was censored, and Mary was censored, and I was censored, and anybody doing good work was censored during COVID. But it's because our stories are so powerful that they have to censor us. That tells us that that's where our leverage comes, and that's what they fear. They fear us talking to each other, they fear us meeting in person, and they fear us telling our stories to each other. I think that's how we convert hearts and minds.
Well, so we have, I guess, about 10 minutes left. So I just want to open it up, you guys. 10 minutes. What do you have that's important to say?
I'll start off. I just want to bring up a recent study. We just uploaded it onto the preprint server. And we looked at the death reports after MMR and MMRV vaccination in the vaccine adverse event reporting system. And we compared those death reports, the amount of those death reports, to measles infection deaths. So we looked since 1995, and since 1995, there has been 2,600% more MMR and MMRV vaccine death reports than there have been measles deaths. And so it's absolutely absurd. We should not be, 2,600% more children should not be dying from a vaccination program. It's absolutely ridiculous. So that means for the past 30 years, it has functioned almost as a death program. It's not working. It's a disaster. A vaccine should never kill more than the disease, never. So they got to think of something else to do with that. And these children particularly, most of these deaths, there was about 300 of them. Most of these deaths occurred within 2 weeks after the vaccine. Most of them were between 1 year old to 1.5 years old, right when they get these shots. And they died of cardiac arrests, sudden infant death syndrome, seizures, encephalitis. And so the clinical presentations were all matching up. The temporality is matching up. And we identified a significant mortality signal with these shots. And so we put it up on the preprint server. We put it up on ResearchGate. And ResearchGate deleted it because they said it was a threat to public security or public health. Yeah, so this censorship cabal, or whoever owns these journals and ResearchGate, there really needs to start being investigations into these entities or individuals, because that is the true threat to public security and public health, to just delete studies.
Yeah, I would add that part of the way in which this entire discussion has been distorted and a great deal of confusion has been sown throughout the general public is the proposition that if it weren't for all of these shots that infants are receiving, these endemic infectious diseases would all come roaring back, and that we'd have Arlington cemeteries full of babies. And I think Del and Mark both pointed out, there's something that we went through in our book. You just go to U.S. Vital Statistics year after year. They're very assiduous about compiling how precisely did Americans die over the years. And they're listed, it's not percentages, it's specific numbers. And you see, by the time the DPT, the schedule was promulgated with DPT in 1948, it was in a recommendation of the American Academy of Pediatrics. All of these infectious disease illnesses, the mortality, not the morbidity, not case counts, but mortality in all of them had plummeted by well over 90% before the schedule was even introduced. Now, why is that? Now, this is where it's useful to know a little something about history. If you go back to London, it was the richest, Victorian London in 1860, the richest city on earth, and you went to an urban slum, and you looked at the conditions in which people lived, their incredibly bad nutrition profile. They did not have clean water. They didn't have sewage. They were inhaling coal smoke. Everybody had, it's called London fog. Everybody had a low-grade case of bronchitis going. I think the most important thing is nutrition. Remember Charles Dickens' novels, Tiny Tim's is crippled from rickets. That's a vitamin D deficiency. So that should be a proxy to how poor nutrition was amongst the urban poor. And then you have no clean water. So the ecological conditions, well, let's just take a century. Between 1848 and 1948 are radically different. Every single living standard of a modern city, whether it be in England, the United States, or Western Europe, had completely transformed, and with it, you see this precipitous drop of infectious disease mortality. But what gets all of the credit? It's not all of these miracles of living standards being elevated across the board, things we completely take for granted. I mean, just the invention of the steamship in canals that just brought food to market on a regular basis rather than subjecting to people to hunger over the winter. Things we totally take for granted now. So I think that the general public needs to understand that the ecology and the nutrition profile and the living standards today are not comparable to where they were when mankind fell in love with vaccines, or I should say the concept of vaccines.
I think that I want to echo what Nick had said regarding censorship. We recently had a paper, Carl Jablanowski was the primary author, I was the second author on it, regarding mortality of infants in the state of Louisiana. And my hat's off to the state of Louisiana for allowing us to get this data. We had infant death data that was cross-matched with vaccination records. It was very brave of them to release that information. it was odd that the majority of the deaths actually clustered much more succinctly around the birth hepatitis B shot, but we did not have enough information. We did not have good match records because the hospitals would not release the vaccination records to the state of Louisiana. But when we looked at the 2-month vaccines, there are 6 vaccines that were required in the state of Louisiana at that particular time. The more vaccines that were added to the program, we not only looked at just vax and unvaxxed, and when we looked at vax and unvaxxed, the vaccinated children had a 25% higher risk of dying of infant death within the 3rd month after receiving the vaccine in the 2nd month. But as we added more and more shots to that 2-month-old visit, we saw it go from 25% to 45% to 60%. And then when you got the 6-in-1 vaccine, yeah, there is a vaccine that combines all 6 of the vaccines that are given at the 2-month well baby checkup. It's called Vaxilis. Then the risk of infant death clustering around those 2-month shots then doubled. So infants getting the vaccines were twice as likely to get infant death than compared to infants that skipped or opted out at the 2-month vaccine point in the schedule. Not only was our paper taken down from preprints.org, okay, which is a preprint, it had not, admittedly not gone through peer review. It was just a preprint, but it was summarily taken down about a week after it was put up. We were not giving a specific reason, but then we put it on a different preprint server called zenodo.org. And when we put it on that preprint server, it was on for about a week. It's still on to the credit of Zenodo and MDPI, which I believe sponsors Zenodo. But now it carries a warning that it is dangerous to public health and public safety, and that it has not been peer-reviewed. So the paper gets its own special warning. So anyhow, we're making a dent, but yeah, we still are the unclean in society.
Briefly, I would like to draw everyone's attention to a study by Sally Ozanoff. It was published in 2018. I believe the first part of the title is Onset of Autism Symptoms. Super important study. I'm about the only guy who talks about it. Sally Ozanoff, she's at UC Davis, published this study in 2018. It was a prospective study, not retrospective, prospective. So they started with a group of normal children, tracked them for 3 years. And the question was, what's the pattern of onset of autism in these children? Traditionally, it was assumed that most children are born with autism, as we discussed earlier. This study is the first study to challenge that assumption. And it looked at the data 3 different ways. Brilliant study design, interviewed 3 different sets of people, parents, doctors, and autism specialists, and tracked the pattern of onset of autism. What she found is that up to 88% of autism cases are characterized by regression. 88% of autism cases, up to 88%, are characterized by regression. What matters about regression is it suggests an acute toxic exposure. And what's the most likely acute toxic exposure? A child well baby visit, the vaccines that they get. So look, 115,000 children per year in the United States develop autism. That's 315 children per day, every day of the year, 365 days a year in the United States develop autism. If Sally Ozanoff's work is correct, that up to 88% of these cases are regression, it means that 277 children every day in the United States, 365 days a year, regress into autism. It is like a plane full of children crashes every day in the United States. And public health authorities continue to pretend that this isn't happening. So Sally Ozonoff's work is really important to this conversation, and we have to stop 115,000 autism cases from happening every year, and the way that we stop that is by keeping toxic chemicals out of kids' bodies. That starts with getting rid of vaccine schedules altogether, but we also have to ban and better regulate about a dozen other toxic chemicals as well.
Okay, thank you very much.